definitely got to outline this video. What should the priority be? Should I do physiology-based categorization or more clinical-based? Well, one thing's for sure. I'm using my executive skills to do this video right now. Woo! Cheesy opening. Successful. Nailed it. Alrighty. Anyway, welcome back to the Trauma Horn SLP. I'm Kim Neely. I'm a licensed speech-language pathologist. And welcome back to, I believe, video 4, I'm pretty sure, of my Welcome to Your Late Diagnosis. Neurodivergence. What up? Pew, 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 pew. Welcome. Today, I'm going to go through executive functions or executive skills. You might hear them called executive skills. The idea here is to just give you some broad understanding of what they are. And then what I really encourage people to do is to think through what things are your strengths versus what are your weaknesses, because everybody has strengths and weaknesses here. Okay? Like everybody does. You might not think it, but think of it as like your strengths. It's not relative to like, you know, the bestest person ever at that task. It's relative to like what you struggle with. What are things that are easy? Those things that are easy are your strengths, you know? It's kind of like, you know, if you're trying to get into better physical shape, you don't want to compare yourself to like Simone Biles, you know? You just want to compare yourself to where you used to be to see that you're making progress. It's kind of that idea, kind of that vibe with executive skills, okay? So let's go ahead and get into it. Executive functions are actually a big part of neurodivergency. This is actually a big part. This is the stuff where outside of regulation and emotional processing and like sensory profile stuff, this is where the neurodivergent brain struggles the most in terms of what our jobs expect of us versus what we're good at doing versus what we need to spend a lot more time and make a lot more effort doing. For a lot of neurodivergents, the easy executive skills, the ones that people expect to just be your basic, easy things, are actually harder. And then the stuff that what we would call a neurotypical brain would find hard are actually easier for neurodivergence. We're usually kind of flipped on the hard to easy scale of executive functions. Not that we're just bad at all of them. That's not actually the case for the most part. Once again, this is a series for late diagnosed neurodivergence, which means I'm presuming you have some level of non-apparent neurodivergency. So like people don't immediately clock you as being different, right? Which means you're given the option to mask, which means people, you know, they judge you later on as being like lazy or a failure or whatever, or a weirdo, you know, or cringe. So for those of us who are in this, like, we kind of could mask for a while and we were able to get stuff done for a while, likely we have strengths in executive skills, but people don't believe we have those strengths because the stuff people think are easy are the things we struggle with. And so therefore they just assume we can't do any of the other high level stuff, when most of the time we're just kind of flip-flopped, actually. Our strengths are easy things, are things that are harder for other people to do. Let's go ahead and get into talking about what executive skills are. Boom. Let's go. So executive functions or executive skills, they're essentially the cognitive processes our brain uses, right, that help us to make decisions and then act upon those decisions, like going through our day, problem solving, reasoning. Like, it's how we get any activity, any task done throughout the day. We use an executive skill for that, or executive functions, usually more than one, for those sort of things, okay? So if you have relatively intact executive functions in the world, in addition to relatively intact physical mobility, you likely have a lot of independence in life as an adult. You're able to get through a lot of daily tasks independently without anybody helping you out, right? You can do your home tasks like cleaning and doing the dishes and stuff. You can do your schoolwork or your homework. You can get all your work stuff relatively done, maybe not completely done, but you're able to prioritize, get the important things done, and then come back to other things later, right? Like, that's somebody with a good level of executive skills to get throughout their day as an independent adult in our society. And quite frankly, as the pace of life has gotten a lot faster, as a lot more demands are placed on us in our workplace, a lot of us are feeling strain on our executive functions and the abilities we have there. because we're getting pushed past what we would expect any human to do. So of course, neurodivergents are definitely struggling, but also like relatively neurotypical people with relatively like what we would expect for executive skills, they are also struggling. So it's just kind of struggle. We're all on the struggle bus, okay? We're all on a struggle bus. We don't all have neurodivergency and we're not all a little autistic. We're just all on the struggle bus for different reasons. But yeah, this is definitely one of those things where for a lot of non-apparent neurodivergence, a lot of late diagnosed neurodivergence, when we want to ask for accommodations from our workplace, we're often asking for accommodations because of either high sensory needs, like sensory stressors, but also the executive functions, the executive skills. We might ask for accommodations to help us with attention or planning or something like that, or memory. And like oftentimes these are the accommodations that we're denied. 9 times out of 10, we're usually denied these, unfortunately. We'll go through the physiological ones, kind of the way it tends to be presented academically, right? Which is like kind of the lower level all the way up to the higher level executive skills. Okay, we're going to talk about those, the cognitive functions we have. But then I'm also going to talk about more of a clinical approach to thinking about them and breaking them down through this thing that I used to use with brain injury patients, like strokes, brain injuries, but also it worked really well with my high schoolers as well. They needed a little help with it, and it was a nice way to think about it. All right, so let's get into the world,
like poetic words that just are strung.
We'll get into the traditional physiological, this is how people talk about it in terms of like your basic skills up to your higher level skills. But in reality, it's not always that way for neurodivergence. Just keep that in mind. Okay, let's go. So the first little group of skills we need to talk about is attention, our attention systems, how we pay attention to things. A lot of attention is mitigated in like brainstem areas and also like midbrain areas, okay? It tends to be stuff that gets handled below the level of where we're consciously aware of things, okay? Which also gets at like ADHDers, my fellow ADHDers out there, like when you're not attending to something, right? And then somebody's like, how, you need to pay attention. And it's like, of course you're not consciously aware of whether or not you're paying attention or not, because like most attention tasks are not handled consciously. Your attention system is paying attention where it feels like it needs to, basically. That's essentially what it's doing. And I personally have a theory that ADHDers, our attention systems are just built to pay attention to different things than most people, which is why we struggle with expected attention, right? Anyway, that's a tangent. Let's talk about what attention is first, though. Okay. So at your most basic level, you have your vigilance system. This is essentially the system that just keeps you awake. Okay. There is a series of neurons. There's some like histamine neurons, which if you know about antihistamines, like especially non-specific antihistamines, like if you take a Benadryl for allergies and you're like me, it's going to knock you right out because it's not specific enough. And it actually like puts those histamine neurons to sleep. The ones that are keeping you awake get turned off. That's why those things knock you out. But that's part of your vigilance system, which is kind of your base level attention of, are you even awake to pay attention? Okay. And sometimes for some medical conditions, people have a real struggle with this, like narcolepsy has trouble with vigilance. Then we have sustained attention. Okay. Sustained attention is essentially when it's kind of what it sounds like. You're able to pay attention to a stimuli for a while. Typically, if you're in the hospital with like a brain injury or a cognitive thing, the way they test this is through like, they might list off letters and say, tap every time you hear the letter A or something, right? That is a sustained task to see if you can pay attention the whole time to all of that, right? And for like schools or at work, it's sustaining your attention through the whole work meeting or paying attention to the whole lecture. This is one type of attention that a lot of people are talking about when it comes to social media and like dopamine and like our inability and like it's affecting our attention systems. And I'm not 100% sold that it's actually really deeply affecting them in some sort of permanent way because our brains are pretty plastic when it comes to local changes like that. I think that we have more of a regulation issue and people use social media as a way to regulate. That's what I personally think. I think that's more of the issue, and that the sustained attention, like if you're really hypervigilant with really high fight, flight, freeze activation, sustained attention is hard. You have to keep a little more calm. You need a little more parasympathetic dominance in order to keep your attention sustained most of the time, unless you have ADHD, because that's a whole separate thing. But for someone without an ADHD type profile, it can be hard to pay attention. And actually, that's one of the ways that trauma responses overlap with ADHD, is this like inability to pay attention the whole time because their system is so hypervigilant. They have so much fight, flight, freeze that they can't calm themselves enough to pay attention all the time. Their brain is just constantly scanning for threats. And so it feels a little more inattentive, like ADHD in that sense. And they also tend to have that like dissociative, like I just checked out for a while thing, which is when the brain is tired of that hypervigilance and kind of crashes, doesn't have the energy to keep it up. So sustained attention is a problem with ADHD, but for like just a natural default way, not in like a panicky way or like in a I'm intentionally trying to be hypervigilant kind of way. I personally think, at least for my brain, even in a relaxed state, my brain is still scanning my environment and just picking up on things. It's just like scanning for changes. Like it's just, it's just kind of my natural default state, which really helps when emergency things happen. I've already processed what happened. So like I can act really quickly and I can be really calm because I already know all the stuff that I need to know about. I don't need to scan the environment. I've already been doing that way below the level of my consciousness, and I didn't really have to think about it. I personally think that's one of the differences with an ADHD brain compared to like a traumatized brain that's doing it more from a I'm under threat feeling, more of like an anxiety, like constant stress, constant threat sort of thing. But the manifestation of the two can feel very similar. And also a lot of ADHDers can also have a lot of that, like feeling unsafe from needing to mask and trying to fit in and that sort of stuff. So we can have a lot of overlap, Hello, Editing Kim here, because as I was editing this, I realized I left off one fairly important attention called selective attention. Selective attention is essentially the form of attention that everyone is actually using when we talk about sustained attention, unless you happen to be in like a sound treated, low stimulation environment where you can really focus on a single thing. So maybe like a testing center or something, perhaps you might truly use sustained attention there. But selective attention is the one where you are able to focus your attention on the thing you want to focus your attention on and ignore all the other stuff going on around you. So, for example, one way I personally have an issue with this is if I'm out at a restaurant with a friend and a total banger starts playing on the music in the background, I have a hard time tuning that out and actually paying attention to my friend. My brain wants to pay attention to the absolute banger that they are currently playing in the background, and I might be the only person at the table who is even aware that that background music is happening, because that seems to be one of the things my brain does pretty much all the time. So that is using selective attention, okay? And it definitely is something I think that neurodivergent brains can sometimes struggle with, depending on who you are, as long as you're not in hyperfocus. I think that ADHD or sustained attention systems are just our attention systems, I personally think, are built more for this other type of attention, which is shifting. I think our attention systems are really good at shifting, but not always consciously. That's the problem. We don't always have conscious control over it, but that's what it's doing a lot of the time. So shifting attention is where you're going back and forth between tasks. Say you're watching a show on Netflix and then like your kids or your spouse come in or your roommate and they come in to ask you a question. So you pause it, you attend to their question, and then you can go back to it. So you shifted your attention from your show to the question and then back to the show. That is shifting attention. Okay. When I'm in hyper-focus mode, shifting attention is hard. It can feel almost painful to have someone call you out of hyperfixation to shift your attention. That's rough. That's tough. Okay. But I do think if I'm not in hyperfixation and I'm just kind of out, like when I'm out just like walking my dog, my brain feels like it's more naturally shifting way below my level of consciousness, I'm usually very aware, like before anybody says it, I'm aware that there's a car coming. I'm aware that there's 3 people over here and there's 2 cars on the road over there, and you have a group of dogs over there, to tend with, and oh, there's a squirrel she's going to want to chase. Like, I'm aware of all those things before other people are, usually. So I think my brain is just built more for shifting attention personally. And I don't know if there's any particular evidence on ADHDers like that, but I would not be surprised if that's more of our thing. And not so much that, like, yes, it can impair sustained attention in the sense that if your brain's naturally shifting, it's going to be hard to sustain. But, it also means that when they try to test our sustained attention and they don't look at what we do good, all we hear about is what our deficits are and what we do bad. We don't hear about what we're good at. You know what I mean? So that's just a little side note on this might be something we're good at. If you have ADHD and you think maybe shifting attention is something you're good at, leave a comment below. Let me know. Then the last little category of attention is divided attention. This is essentially when you are paying attention to 2 or more things happening at once. Divided attention is the kind of thing where if you are trying to attend to 2 things at once, the more things you add to pay attention to, the reduced your ability to attend to all of it. Okay? So if you're cooking a new recipe and you have or maybe you're cooking a meal and it's your first time cooking this really big fancy Thanksgiving kind of thing or whatever, and you have 6 different things you're making all at once and you're trying to pay attention to all 6 things, it's going to be really hard and probably really tiring because dividing your attention across 6 different tasks all at once is pretty exhausting for your attention systems. We're not actually good at it. One example of divided attention also, and this is a little cute little fun trivia thing that I learned about in my TBI class. Our teacher was telling us that divided attention is essentially the thing, if you're trying to find somebody's house, say you're driving and you're trying to find someone's house and maybe try to find a place to park and you're trying to figure out which house it is and you're listening to the radio or you're listening to a podcast, you're probably going to turn off the radio or the podcast because your brain is dividing its attention to the podcast / music and then also trying to figure out where the house is. Or where to park, perhaps, if you're in a city or something. And so you tend to, you automatically, just by habit, you automatically will just turn off the distractor because it's reducing your ability to do the reasoning and problem solving part, the thing that you're attending to that takes a little more cognitive resources. You don't have as many if you have that extra distraction. So you have to turn it down. Just so you know, that's why we do that. Let's move on to the next set of executive skills. The next set of executive skills, which I said that way and I'm not exactly sure why, but I feel like it's a reference to something, is memory. Okay? Short-term and long-term memory. We got lots of different types of memory. Okay? So short-term memory in a physiological sense, it really only lasts for 5 to 7 seconds. It's essentially how long that connection between those neurons is still firing. And then once it's done, it's gone. That's the traditional actual short-term memory. And it's it's meaningful if you're measuring neuronal firing or something. If you're in a lab or something that's measuring that, sure, it's meaningful. But for most of us, what people tend to talk about when they talk about short-term memory, kind of the colloquial use of short-term memory, is actually usually some form of working memory that we're dealing with. Working memory overlaps with divided attention a lot. It uses very similar neural pathways in our brain, but working memory also includes using long-term memory, if you're trying out a new recipe, but it's similar to an old recipe, you might have that knowledge of the old recipe, and you also have all the steps of the new recipe and all the things you're having to keep track of. And then you can also manipulate the information maybe in your head, maybe I don't want to add quite as much pepper as it's calling for because I don't particularly like pepper or something like that, right? Or ooh, that sounds like too much salt. Maybe I'll adjust the salt to start out with, and then I can add more if I need to, right? Or whatever. That's working memory. So cooking is a good example of using working memory. And it also, of course, if you're using working memory, you're also often using divided attention, essentially. Those 2 things are happening at once, okay? So yeah, but anytime you're doing something that requires a lot of different steps, You're having to keep all those steps in mind. Maybe you're having to make adjustments to what you're doing and the task and the rules of the task. That's all working memory stuff. When you're taking tests, you're usually using working memory and ideally pulling from long-term memory to some extent. But yeah, this is working memory, okay? All right, now let's get into long-term memory because we have two main types of long-term memory as well. We have explicit long-term memory, meaning like we're consciously aware of that. And we have implicit, which is the long-term memory that we're not as consciously aware of, essentially, okay? So explicit long-term memory include things like semantic memory. This is your memory for facts, okay? This is your memory for nursery rhymes. This is your memory for music lyrics, okay? This is your semantic explicit memory. General knowledge about things. Then you have episodic memory as well in this long-term explicit memory stores. And this is where you have a recalling of events or experiences that's happened to you. So if somebody says like, how was your vacation? And you're like, oh, it was so great. Like we, on the first day we went here and then we ate there and we saw this landmark. And then the next day we did this. That's episodic memory. Okay. It's kind of coming from semantic, but it's also episodic, right? You're being able to tell a story in time, essentially. And that sort of explicit long-term memory. And then we have implicit, which is the long-term memory that a lot of people don't really think about, but that does affect us a good amount. One of the biggest areas is procedural/habitual memory, which habitual, it is what it says. It's essentially the skills and habits you do without thinking about it. So like muscle memory. Back in the day when you used to dial phone numbers, a lot of us had muscle memory for the phone number we wanted to dial. We didn't always remember how to say the number. We just knew how to dial the number. Doot, doot, doot. Or if you were in a school that had combination locks on lockers, same thing. You might not remember the actual combination after the end of the year, but you remember how to actually turn it. You remember where to stop turning. And that was your muscles remembered, right? You had this habitual memory, this long-term memory that was built over time, over doing that habit over and over and over again. Okay. That also is a type of memory that is very impacted in Parkinson's disease. And diseases that affect the dopamine stores in the basal ganglia, which is different than your intentional, like your dopamine in your reward centers, different area of the brain. But yeah, so Parkinson's disease really impacts like procedural memory and like muscle memory for like walking and posture and that kind of stuff. And then another type of implicit memory is associative learning. So this is like the Pavlov's dogs thing. Okay. This is like classical conditioning where like, yeah, the dog salivated when they heard the bell for food. Their brain knew the food was coming, so they would start to salivate, right? They're hungry. So this is learned associations between stimuli, and part of associated learning also kind of overlaps, depending on who you're talking to, might include emotional memory, right? So like if you smell the smell of your grandmother's cookies baking, right? Maybe she's not making it, but you smell the smell. If your mom is making those cookies or something, maybe that brings up an emotional memory, right? I've had that happen before where like you're walking around and you suddenly get a smell and then you suddenly have a memory of like somewhere you were on vacation that was really awesome. And it's like, oh, wow, that's a sudden emotional memory related to that smell that you didn't consciously know you had. But then it triggered the episodic and semantic memories to come flooding in from where you were, right? That's kind of how that goes. You have that implicit memory you don't know about, but then it can trigger the explicit memory that you are aware about. So those are our types of memory, okay, that help build up our cognitive skills. And attention and memory tend to be considered slightly lower skills, especially attention. That tends to be, all those attention centers are tended to be like, these are the basic things. This is the way the brain is wired in a basic way. And the thought is essentially if you're going from down here up to the brain here, you're going like lower level, more basic skills to higher level skills. I think that's what's wrong when we interpret neurodivergent brains. I don't think that's how neurodivergent brains are wired. And quite frankly, it might not be how most people's brains are wired. That's just the colloquial idea. Or at least not colloquial. That's the given idea of how our brains evolved and therefore whether certain things are basic or not. Hi, editing me again. And just wanted to emphasize that when I say this is the sort of thought of how our brains have evolved, that's very likely incredibly untrue, actually, and has been fairly debunked in most like neuroscience and physiology type circles, because the reality is animal brains just evolved to do whatever that animal needs to do in whatever environment it's in, and our brains are not really an exception to that. However, there is still, this lower to higher brain areas for processing in terms of processing speed. Like your brainstem is going to be a lot faster in terms of processing things than your midbrain, and your midbrain is faster than your prefrontal cortex because all the information actually has to get to your prefrontal cortex from these other centers in order for you to do some reasoning or problem solving or make a decision on these things. Which is why attention is so important, and why, like, for example, ADHDers are known to not have the best memory because, well, if you don't attend to something, then that information doesn't get into your brain in order for it to use in the conscious part of your brain and, like, actually reason with it and maybe encode a memory by it. Essentially, attention has to happen before you're able to encode a memory, if that makes sense. But I do also think that in the natural variance of humans and being a collective species that like survives through community, especially thinking way back in Neolithic, caveman times or whatever, we all survived by coming together as a community, right? I think it's very likely that within a community unit, it makes sense you would have some brains wired for certain tasks versus others. And so I personally think that a lot of neurodivergents probably were wired. We probably had neurodivergence back then who wouldn't have been considered neurodivergents in like a tribal, nomadic, hunter-gatherer type society. Maybe they were just the brains who were better at one task over another. And so they just did those roles. They were just the people who were better at that. That's my theory. I know it's evolutionary based. You can't really prove it, but I wouldn't be too surprised if our brains are just wired differently enough that and obviously, yes, there are people with more medical impacts and stuff, and that is a different discussion there. But that doesn't mean they also don't have some strengths and weaknesses in these areas as well. You know what I mean? Okay, anyway, let's go into the higher level ones after that little tangent. That's why I call these the higher level ones. So when you get to your conscious area of your brain, when you get to up here, okay, when information gets up here, when you talk about the skills we have up there in the prefrontal cortex, that's where we get things like our cognitive flexibility, like our ability to kind of like adapt to changes and think through things and reason and plan and problem solve, right? This stuff all happens here, okay, in this part, which is also why like little kids aren't the best at it, because this isn't as developed in little kids, right? They might not be the best at like planning and problem solving, right? They might not be the best at switching between tasks, like consciously switching. That sort of flexibility piece might be hard. And it's also very hard for neurodivergence, like I said, when we're in hyperfixation. Moving out of hyperfixation is very hard. It can be very nigh on painful to do. It's just frustrating, honestly. Okay, so we have that cognitive flexibility. We also have inhibition. This is the ability to hold us back from doing things that probably aren't the best idea, or maybe it just isn't the right time, right? It's the ability to kind of suppress our instincts and suppress our immediate desires or impulsive desires to respond, right? Inhibitory control is what allows people to do the like per my last email professional response when they're actually seething, right? They're inhibiting their desire to just cuss out that person and instead writing a very nice responsive email, professionally responsive email. You know what I mean? So inhibitory control is also the thing that keeps you people from like, yeah, I'm not going to jump off of this really high place onto that hard surface because that will probably really hurt me. That's also inhibition, okay? It's an important skill to have. We expect adults to have it. Neurodivergents can struggle with it. Problem solving, planning, those two things go together a lot, but planning meaning like you can prioritize what should be first. Where do you start with this step? If I want to cook this new recipe, what do I need to do first? Planning, right? And then problem solving is like analyzing things, reasoning through it, and then like trying to figure out your steps to get out of some sort of complex like issue or situation you're in, right? And then there's also what's called set shifting, which is essentially transitioning between different sets or tasks. Like Mainly like when you're going from one completely different task to another, right? So like you finished cooking and now you're going to go and do the laundry. And that's like a completely different mental task, right? And you're able to switch smoothly between those. And it relates a lot to cognitive flexibility, obviously, your ability to shift those sort of things. So it's a little higher level than attention because you're dealing with the working memory piece as well and the long-term memory piece and all the attention centers and stuff to do the full set shifting and the conscious awareness of the need to do it, right? So that's why it's considered higher level, because you're consciously aware that you are shifting. If that makes sense. Whereas attention tends to be more situated lower where we're not as consciously aware, which is what makes ADHD really hard because people judge us for not paying attention, but we are not consciously in control of our attention most of the time. That is kind of, nobody really is, and our attention is different enough that people don't like it. They don't like that we shift when they don't expect us to shift. But that's a thing that happens. Hey, it's different. Hey. And it can definitely impair us and definitely can be a disability under the social model of disability because it's very rare that people will be willing to accommodate our need to attend differently or to use fidgets or to take breaks and chunk out tasks so we can maintain our attention for like more efficiently or whatever. Like if we have strategies and accommodations we want to use, a lot of people want to deny the use of those things because they assume our inability to attend is such a basic thing that we're basically little kids who just can't attend. And I would like to say it's different attention, and the reason it's a disability and it's a struggle is because society does not let us deal with it the way we need to and doesn't respect that it's different, quite frankly. So that's a little soapbox. Let's move on. Here's the resource that I tend to use. I use this with my students, like I said, and with like brain injury patients and stuff like that when I worked in the hospital. This is called Goal Plan Do Review Revise. So this is a clinical program that has been in development for a long time and has been in place for a long time. It came from helping people with significant, like severe brain injuries when they start to recover, helping them kind of learn what their current cognitive weaknesses are, and then what their strengths are, and then how they can use those strengths to help create strategies and stuff with those weaknesses so they can hopefully get back to some level of independent living and good quality of life. That's kind of the whole intention here. But they categorize executive functions, executive skills a little differently. In fact, the only attention one they talk about is sustained attention. That's the only one they mention in that area. But it's because I think they're thinking more of these executive skills of like how we really use these skills on a day-to-day basis to complete our daily tasks. The way I just categorized them and talked about them with you guys is essentially the physiological, evolutionary, what we consider basic to advanced way, which is the way you learn if you're taking an academic course on it or something. But clinically, sometimes it's a lot easier to just think of things as more of how do we apply these things to our life, right? The application is usually more the focus clinically because you're trying to get people back to like independent living, ideally, and hopefully a good quality of life and that kind of thing, right? So the way they tend to do, they divide them up into planning skills, self-control skills, and monitoring skills, okay? And their planning skills are things like planning and prioritizing, so like knowing what steps to do and in what order to get things done, organizing, so like knowing where you put certain things. I'm really good at organizing electronically. I'm really bad at organizing physical items. Classic ADHDer. Oh my gosh. Really bad at organizing physical things and paper. That just ends up in a pile somewhere. But like I would have in graduate school, people would be like, you're so organized because they only saw my laptop. And it's like, I can organize electronic stuff. I don't know why. I think it's because you can just click and drag it and it's just easier. But like physical things, never heard that. Prior to laptops being the thing that we used to work with, I never had anyone tell me I was ever organized when it was all like files and paper. No one would have ever said that. Oh my gosh. They still wouldn't. Okay. There's also time management where you can judge how long a task is. I'm not particularly great at that. Right? So knowing how long something will take, what the deadline is, task management obviously relates to planning and prioritizing a lot. But yeah, it's part of planning it. When do I need to start this task? If this thing is due now at this time, when do I need to start it, right? Time management. Their self-control skills that they talk about are things like your sustained attention, which they define as paying attention even if you don't feel like it. So being able to maintain your attention even if you don't want to, like you're at a work meeting and it's really boring. Sustained attention. I'm obviously not that good at that. Task initiation. So being able to start something kind of relates to time management, right? As long as you can initiate when you should, you don't procrastinate for too long, hopefully you can get the thing done in time. There's also the inhibition, of course, right? So not saying or doing something that might result in a bad outcome, a negative consequence for yourself or for others. There's emotional control, which is keeping your cool, being able to kind of regulate yourself, basically, being able to like calm yourself down so you don't fly off the handle suddenly. And then there's goal-directed persistence, which is an interesting one, definitely more of a like prefrontal cortex area thing, which is sticking with something. So if you have a long-term goal, being able to like give up like a few little things to get to that long-term goal, right? So like, you know, I used to say this with high schoolers, it would be like, if you want to graduate, but you have finals you have to finish in order to graduate, but then a new video game comes out that week and you really want to play the new video game. Long-term goal is graduation, right? So hold back, don't play the video game until you're done with your finals, and then you can graduate and then you play the game, right? That's a persistence thing, being able to inhibit the desire for the short-term goal for the sake of making it to your long-term goal, okay? And then you have stress tolerance, which is similar to emotional control, being able to manage your stress, relax yourself as needed, dealing with any kind of uncertainty or demands that come up, like being able to kind of still access your reasoning through things there, okay? And then they talk about monitoring skills. Now, this is where they talk about working memory, which makes sense because it's where you're paying attention to all the different tasks and you're able to manipulate the information and make sure things are going right. So if you're cooking something right, if something starts to burn, your working memory is telling you, whoa, we got to handle that, right? So it makes sense you're monitoring with working memory. They also have cognitive flexibility as part of their monitoring, which also makes sense. I think that relates more to that set shifting idea, where you can shift between two different tasks with two different like rules to them and two different like procedures to them, that you're able to do it when you need to. And I think that's part of the monitoring is like, you know, if you're cooking one thing and then you have to go attend to something else, having that flexibility to do that and then come back. And then they also have metacognition. So metacognition is essentially, this isn't something I would expect a kid to have. Little kids don't expect a lot of metacognition. And for some people with intellectual disabilities of some degree, metacognition might be difficult. It might not be as present and available to people who have really more significant cognitive needs, support needs in terms of cognition and executive function. But metacognition is being able to kind of observe yourself as sort of an outsider, essentially, being able to evaluate how you're doing, right? So being able to be like, did I do pretty well on that thing or not, right? How am I actually at that task from like, try to be as objective as you can, right? So that's the idea behind metacognition. And I am good at that in the sense that I reflect on myself all the freaking time. But it also is kind of a catch-22 because mental health-wise, it's not always great that I reflect on myself all the time. If you have anxiety and depression, sometimes the metacognition can kind of kick you in the, you kick yourself in the pants.
Words that just are strung
By trying to reflect, and then everything just tells you you're terrible all the time. So that's catch-22 there when it comes to mental health with these how they overlap with executive skills. When I think of myself, it's like, okay, you know what? I'm not that great at task initiation. I'm not that great at time management, but I have learned how to adjust time management, which is I give myself way more time than I think. So if my brain says, it's only going to take me like a couple hours to do that thing, I immediately triple that time, and I might even add a little extra time. So I might be like, I actually probably should start it like 3 days earlier just to make sure I get through it, because I'm really bad at just assuming, right? And that's also one of the reasons why I have time blindness and I end up late to places, because I'm really bad at figuring out how long it'll take me to go from one place to the next or shift from this task to the next task. Like, I'm really bad at that. Obviously, sustained attention is hard, but if I fidget, it's easier. I've learned to address that a little bit. I'm pretty good at metacognition. I'm not too bad at stress tolerance and flexibility at this point. I probably was worse when I was younger, but I've gotten a lot better at those things, right? I'm pretty decent at persistence. I can be a pretty persistent person, so it's like, these are the sort of things where I think it's just nice to be like, what are you pretty good at, right? And one of the biggest tips I think for that is, especially as a late diagnosed neurodivergent, is if you recognize something as your weakness, if you've already thought of some strategies to help with that, then problem solving that is probably a strength, right? Like if you've already thought of, well, I deal with time management issues this way, or I deal with emotional control issues this way, then probably like you were pretty good at like planning and like reasoning through what you needed to do to help yourself, right? You were probably pretty good at like remembering what those strategies are, right? Like it's that kind of thing. That would be my biggest tip though for late diagnosed neurodivergent is you are probably able to rattle off exactly what your weaknesses are, but the challenge would be, what are your strengths? I think that's a much more enlightening and much more important question to ask ourselves because very few people tell us. We have to actually try to figure it out on our own. And it's hard and it's frustrating. But you might be better at the higher level skills like reasoning, problem solving, cognitive flexibility. You might be better at that than a neurotypical. It's very possible. You know what I mean? I'm hoping some of that knowledge kind of helped a little bit, or at least maybe makes you feel a little more empowered that like we all have different strengths and weaknesses. Neurotypicals have different strengths and weaknesses too. And just because like if their strength is attention, sustained attention, and that's not your strength, it doesn't mean you don't have strengths, and it doesn't mean you're not good at anything in terms of your brain skills and how you get through your day and your life and stuff, right? So yeah. Anyway, with all that said, I hope you found this somewhat helpful. If you want me to unpack something a little more or is a little less than clear than you would like to, Billy, please also let me know either in a comment below or send me a message or shoot me an email. My email's in the show notes. And I have been talking for a very long time today. I did a lot of filming and I probably should stop talking because my brain is starting to get very fuzzy. I think I exceeded my mental energy right now for this. So, in the effort of embracing our weirdness, reclaiming that word, and using our weirdness powers for good as a way to connect with others and build a safe community based on compassion and understanding for each other, I wish for you all to keep it weird. I need to put down what's in my hand, which is not the stuffy anymore. Keep it weird, everybody. And until next time, bye.